I was the daughter my parents prayed for after 3 years of bitter medicinal treatments. They once treasured me like a precious jewel. When I casually mentioned wanting to see the ocean, Dad immediately bought plane tickets and flew me to the coast. Mom hand-sewed princess dresses for me, saying I was heaven's greatest gift to her. Later, Mom unexpectedly gave birth to my little brother. She kissed my forehead and said love wouldn't diminish. It would only grow, with one more person to protect me. But my brother had severe asthma. He couldn't tolerate even the slightest irritating smell. That day, I saw my brother sleeping restlessly, so I lit the aromatherapy candle Mom usually used to help her relax. When Mom smelled the fragrance, her eyes filled with rage. She slapped me so hard I fell to the ground, then grabbed my hair and screamed, "Your brother can't breathe smoke. Are you trying to kill him?" I was dragged into the basement home theater, a room that had just been soundproofed but didn't have a ventilation system installed yet. The heavy soundproof door was locked from the outside. "You're so vicious. Stay in this absolutely quiet place and think about what you've done." Mom and Dad rushed my brother to the hospital in a panic. They both forgot. Once that expensive professional soundproof door closed, not even a wisp of air could get through. In the extreme oxygen deprivation and darkness, I clawed desperately at the door. As my consciousness faded, I could only think, if I apologize, will they love me again? One. With a loud bang, the heavy professional soundproof door of the basement home theater slammed shut. Immediately after, I heard the lock turning from outside. The sound was particularly harsh in the dead-silent basement, like a death sentence being pronounced. "Mom, I was wrong. Please let me out." "Dad, it's so dark in here. I'm scared. Please open the door." I ignored my swollen cheek from Mom's slap and the stinging pain where she'd pulled my hair. I crawled to the door and pounded on the cold metal with all my strength. But this home theater had been specially built for the ultimate viewing experience. All four walls were covered with thick sound-absorbing foam, and even the door seams had the tightest seals. My cries, my desperate pounding, everything was greedily swallowed by the foam. Not a sound escaped to the outside. I was surrounded by absolute darkness and deathly silence. I could even hear my own heart pounding violently from fear. Thump, thump, thump. So fast it felt like it would jump out of my throat. "Is anyone there? Help me." I called out hoarsely, but only silence answered. As time passed, the air in the home theater grew thinner and thinner. Without a ventilation system installed, this place was like a completely sealed can. Each breath felt like inhaling burning flames. My lungs were seared with tearing pain. Sweat rolled down my forehead in large drops, hitting the cold floor. My vision blurred, and my oxygen-starved brain grew dizzy. Just when I was about to collapse, I suddenly felt the children's smartwatch on my wrist. It was the birthday gift Dad had given me last month. "Anna, if you ever encounter danger, just press this button and Daddy will immediately come protect you." Dad's gentle words from back then seemed to echo in my ears. I grabbed onto this last lifeline. With trembling fingers, I pressed the speed dial button for Dad. Ring, ring. The dialing tone sounded in the silent room. Each pause made my heart skip a beat. "Answer the phone, Dad." "Please answer the phone." Finally, the call connected. "Hello?" Dad's impatient voice came through, with the chaotic sounds of a hospital emergency room and my brother's weak crying in the background. "Dad, save me. I can't breathe." I used every ounce of strength to force these words into the watch microphone. "Anna Johnson, you have the nerve to call?" Dad's voice instantly shot up, filled with barely suppressed rage. "Your brother is still being treated. Do you know you almost killed him?" "I didn't. I just wanted to help him sleep better." "Dad, I feel terrible. There's no air in the basement." I begged through tears, which fell in large drops onto the watch screen. "Enough. How long are you going to keep pretending? It's bad enough you compete for attention at home, but now you've learned to lie too. The basement is huge. How could there be no air? You stay in there and think about what you've done. No one's letting you out without your mother's permission." Beep, beep, beep. The call was mercilessly disconnected. I stared blankly at the darkened watch screen as my last shred of hope died. Why didn't they believe me? Why didn't Dad, who used to love me so much, even have the patience to hear me out anymore? Scenes from the past flashed uncontrollably through my mind. When I was 5, I ran a high fever in the middle of the night. Dad was so panicked he didn't even put on shoes. He ran 2 kilometers through the snow carrying me to the hospital. He sat by my bed, gripping my hand tightly, his eyes red as he said, "Don't be afraid, Anna. Daddy's here. Daddy will bear all your pain for you." When I was 6, some kids at preschool bullied me. Mom stormed into the school like an enraged lioness, pointed at the boy's nose and yelled at him, then held me gently and comforted me. "Anna is Mommy's most precious little princess. No one can bully you." But after my brother Asher was born, everything changed. They gave all their love and attention to their sickly little boy. I became superfluous, a dangerous element who might hurt my brother at any moment. I just saw my brother coughing and unable to sleep. I remembered how Mom would light that aromatherapy candle whenever she had a headache, saying the scent helped her relax. I thought it would help my brother feel better too. I really never meant to hurt him. I don't want to die. I really don't want to die. I threw myself at the door again, desperately clawing at the seams, trying to create a gap for air to get through. My fingernails broke off. Blood ran down the door panel. The pain shot through my fingers and made my whole body shake, but I didn't dare stop. Mom, Daddy, Anna was wrong. Anna won't make brother angry anymore. Please, let me out. My voice grew weaker and weaker until it became meaningless mumbling. My eyelids felt heavy as lead. I finally couldn't hold on anymore and slowly slid down the cold door panel to the floor. In the last moment before losing consciousness, I seemed to see a beam of light. Mom pushed open the door and walked toward me, backlit. She crouched down and gently touched my bleeding fingers, her tears dropping onto my cheeks. Anna, my baby, I'm sorry. Mommy came too late. I tried so hard to smile, to tell her I forgave her. As long as you can love me like before, I don't mind suffering a little. But that beam of light gradually dimmed, and Mom's face became blurry. I fell completely into endless darkness.
2.
I seemed to have a very, very long dream. In the dream, there was no suffocating pain, no terrifying darkness, only lightness and freedom. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself floating in midair. I looked down at myself. My body was semi-transparent, emitting a faint glow. Am I dead? This thought had barely crossed my mind when a familiar sound of the door opening interrupted it. Mom and Dad came home from the hospital with my brother. Mom, I instinctively called out and tried to throw myself into her arms, but my body passed straight through hers. She couldn't feel me or hear my voice. Mom carefully placed my sleeping brother on the sofa, covered him with a thin blanket, then let out a long sigh of relief. Thank God. The doctor said Asher only had a mild asthma attack. If we'd gotten there any later, the consequences would have been unthinkable. Mom's voice still trembled with lingering fear. Dad lovingly put his arm around Mom's shoulders and comforted her. It's okay now. Asher has divine protection. Mom took a deep breath. Her originally gentle eyes instantly became filled with poisonous hatred. She said through gritted teeth, it's all that wretched girl Anna's fault. She's just jealous that we treat Asher well, so she came up with such a vicious way to hurt him. To be so cruel at such a young age. What will she be like when she grows up? She's rotten to the core. Hearing Mom's words, my heart felt like it was being stabbed with needles. I'm not rotten. I didn't try to hurt my brother. I just wanted to help him. I floated in front of them, shaking my head desperately and explaining loudly, but they couldn't hear anything. Dad frowned and sighed. Come on, she's still just a kid. Maybe she was confused for a moment. We've locked her in the basement for so long, she's probably scared enough. Go get her and have her apologize to Asher. Then we'll call it even. Apologize? What good is an apology? Who's going to suffer for what Asher went through? Mom's voice shot up like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. She stomped angrily to my first-floor bedroom door and pounded on it hard. Anna Johnson, get out here. Don't think you can avoid responsibility by hiding in there playing dead. Your brother almost died because of you. Can't you even say you're sorry? Did a dog eat your conscience? I floated beside Mom, looking at her face twisted with anger, feeling deeply powerless. Mom, I'm not in my room. I'm in the basement, in that soundproof room you locked with your own hands. I'm already dead. But of course there was no response from the room. Mom's fury was completely ignited by the silence. She turned around, her eyes searching everywhere in the living room, as if looking for something to vent on. Suddenly, her gaze fell on the exquisite cat bed on the balcony. Inside slept a beautiful ragdoll cat named Snowball. I'd found her as a stray in the bushes on a rainy day. She was dying then, and I used my allowance to take her to the vet and nursed her back to health until she became this white, plump, adorable cat. Mom used to love Snowball too, saying she looked like a little snowball. But now, Mom's eyes were filled with disgust. We have someone with asthma in this house, and we're still keeping this furry creature. Anna just doesn't want Asher to be well. She strode over and grabbed the cat bed, ignoring Snowball's terrified cries.
Mom.
No, please don't hurt Snowball. I desperately rushed over, trying to stop her. But I could only watch helplessly as she opened the balcony window and, without hesitation, threw the cat bed with Snowball inside from the 15th floor. Meow. Snowball's piercing shriek cut through the night, then abruptly stopped. I floated in midair, staring into the bottomless darkness outside the window, feeling my very soul trembling. Dad stood in the living room, watching all this, only frowning slightly. Well, it needed to go anyway. Asher's allergic to cat fur. He spoke in a flat tone, as if what had been thrown out was just a piece of worthless trash. Forget about that girl. Let her go hungry for a couple meals. She'll realize her mistake. They turned and went back to the master bedroom, closing the door. The living room returned to dead silence. Only I remained, drifting alone in this home that had once been filled with laughter and joy. I drifted toward the balcony, my form passing through the glass door as easily as a breath of cold wind. I looked down into the courtyard 15 stories below. The streetlights cast long, pale shadows across the concrete, and there, in a small, crumpled heap of white, lay Snowball. She didn't look like a cat anymore. She looked like a discarded plush toy, still and small. I tried to cry, but no tears came. A ghost, it seemed, had no tears to shed, only a hollow ache where a heart used to beat. Turning back, I glided through the silent apartment. I passed the master bedroom, where the door was shut tight. From inside, I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of my parents breathing, alongside the light, occasional wheezing of my little brother, Asher. They were asleep. They had tucked themselves into their warm, feather-down blankets, safe and secure, while their daughter lay cold in the dark below. I sank through the floorboards, descending into the chilly dampness of the basement. The basement was always the coldest part of the house, but tonight it felt like an icebox. I drifted through the heavy, professional soundproof door. Inside the home theater, the darkness was absolute, but to my new eyes, everything was visible in a strange, gray-blue hue. My body lay slumped against the base of the door. I floated down and knelt beside myself. It was a surreal thing, looking at your own corpse. My face was pale, almost blue under the dim spectral light. My eyes were half open, glazed and vacant, staring at nothing. My fingertips were raw, the nails torn back and encrusted with dried black blood where I had clawed at the impenetrable seals of the door. On my left wrist, the children's smartwatch still clung to my cold skin. Its screen was dark, the battery exhausted from my final, desperate call to the one person who should have saved me. I reached out, wanting to brush a stray lock of hair from my own forehead, but my hand simply dissolved through my own cold flesh, leaving nothing but a faint shimmer in the air. I'm really dead, I realized. There is no waking up from this. I sat beside my body in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise. Morning arrived, though no light reached the sealed theater. I only knew it was day because I felt the subtle shift in the house above, the pipes groaning as water ran, the heavy footsteps of my father, and the light, pattering steps of my mother preparing breakfast. I drifted back up to the kitchen. The smell of toasted bread and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. It was a smell I used to love. Mom was standing by the stove, flipping golden pancakes. Her face was calm, though a bit tired. Dad sat at the dining table, scrolling through his tablet, a cup of coffee resting near his elbow. Asher sat in his high chair, happily banging a plastic spoon against the tray. His cheeks were rosy again, the terrifying episode of the previous night seemingly forgotten. Eat some more, Asher, Mom said, her voice dripping with a sweetness she hadn't shown me in over a year. She cut a small piece of pancake and blew on it before feeding it to him. My brave boy. You went through so much yesterday. Dad looked up from his tablet. How is his breathing today? Much better, Mom sighed, leaning against the counter. The nebulizer worked wonders. Thank goodness we got him to the clinic when we did. Her expression suddenly hardened, the warmth vanishing from her face. If it weren't for that selfish girl. Dad sipped his coffee. She's probably still downstairs. Have you gone down to check on her? No, Mom said coldly, turning back to the stove. Let her stay there a bit longer. She needs to understand the gravity of what she did. She actually tried to suffocate her own brother with that smoke. If we let her off too easily this time, she'll do something worse next time. She's only 9, Helen, Dad muttered, though there was no real conviction in his voice. Though, she did lie to me on the phone. She claimed there was no air in the basement. I don't know where she learned to be so manipulative. She gets it from your side of the family, Mom snapped. Always playing the victim. Don't go soft on her, Richard. If we don't teach her a lesson now, she'll end up ruined. I stood right beside Dad, looking down at his tablet. On the screen was an article about local real estate. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like the father who had carried me on his shoulders through the park, who had bought me cotton candy and promised to always protect me. Dad, I whispered, leaning close to his ear. I didn't lie. I really couldn't breathe. Please go look. He didn't hear me. He merely rubbed his ear, murmuring, drafty in here today, before turning the page on his tablet. By noon, the house was quiet again. Asher was taking his afternoon nap. Mom was folding laundry in the master bedroom, and Dad had gone into his home office to take some work calls. No one had mentioned my name since breakfast. It was as if my absence was a relief to them, a temporary peace they were eager to prolong. The The space I used to occupy in this family had already shrunk so much over the past year, but now it felt completely erased. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon when Dad finally came out of his office. He stretched his arms and walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water. "Helen," he called out. "It's been almost 20 hours. Don't you think it's time to bring her up? She hasn't had anything to eat or drink." Mom walked out of the bedroom, a basket of folded clothes in her arms. She frowned, looking toward the basement door at the end of the hallway. "I suppose. She's probably crying her eyes out down there. I want her to write a full apology letter to Asher before she's allowed to have any dinner." "All right," Dad said, setting his glass down. "I'll go down and get her." I followed Dad as he walked down the hallway. My heart, or the memory of it, began to race. This was it, the moment the illusion would shatter. Dad opened the basement door and switched on the stairs light. The yellow bulb cast long, staircase-shaped shadows down into the gloom. He walked down, his leather slippers making soft thud-thud sounds on the carpeted steps. "Anna," he called out, his voice echoing slightly. "Anna, come out. Your mother is ready to talk to you." There was no answer, only the heavy, dead silence of the basement. Dad reached the bottom of the stairs. He walked over to the home theater door. The heavy brass lock was still turned to the horizontal position locked. He reached out and turned the key, the metallic click sounding loud and sharp. "Anna, stop playing games. Get out here," he said, pulling the heavy door outward. Because my body had been slumped directly against the door, the moment the seal broke, the physical form of his daughter slid limply outward, her head resting against the toe of his slipper. Dad froze. The air that rushed out of the room was warm, stale, and smelled faintly of copper and sweat. "Anna?" Dad whispered. He bent down, reaching out to touch my shoulder. "Anna, stop it. This isn't funny. Get up." He rolled my body over. My head lolls to the side, my lifeless, cloudy eyes staring straight up at the ceiling lights. Dad's hand snapped back as if he had touched hot iron. He staggered a step backward, his face turning an ash-gray color. "Helen," he called out, his voice cracking, barely above a whisper. "Helen, come down here. Quick." "What is it now?" Mom's impatient voice drifted down from the top of the stairs. "Is she throwing another tantrum?" She walked down the stairs, her high heels clicking sharply. But her footsteps slowed as she reached the bottom and saw Dad standing there, trembling, staring at the floor. She looked down. The basket of laundry slipped from her hands. White towels and colorful shirts tumbled across the dusty concrete floor. "No," Mom whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. "No, no, no." She rushed forward, falling to her knees beside my body. She grabbed my shoulders and shook me, her manicured nails digging into my lifeless flesh. "Anna, Anna, wake up. Look at Mommy. Stop playing." "Richard, why is she so cold? Why is she so cold?" I don't know," Dad stammered. He was clutching his head, his chest heaving as he stared at my bloody, torn fingernails, then at the thick, airtight rubber seals lining the edges of the soundproof door. He looked at the door, then at the lock, then at his own hands. The ventilation," Dad whispered, his voice shaking so hard he could barely form the words. "Helen, the contractors? They hadn't installed the intake valves yet. It was completely sealed." Mom's eyes widened. She looked at the door, then down at my face. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her entire body went rigid, and a sound came out of her throat, a low, animalistic whimper that gradually rose into a piercing, shattered scream. "No, no. I didn't know," she shrieked, pulling my cold body into her arms, crushing me against her chest. "Anna, my baby. Mommy's sorry. Mommy didn't mean to. Wake up. Please wake up." I stood a few feet away, watching them. I had thought that if they saw me dead, I would feel some sense of justice, or perhaps a deep sadness. But looking at them now, I felt strangely empty. Mom was rocking my corpse back and forth, her tears washing over my pale, dirty cheeks. Her expensive silk blouse was stained with the dried blood from my fingertips. Dad had collapsed onto his knees beside her, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently as he sobbed. "Call 911. Mom cried out, her voice raw. "Richard, call them. Tell them to bring an ambulance. Hurry." Dad fumbled in his pockets, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his phone twice before finally picking it up. He dialed the numbers with a trembling thumb. "Hello? Yes, my daughter." Dad choked out, his voice thick with tears. She's not breathing. She's cold. Please send help. Our address is." As he spoke, his eyes fell upon my left wrist. The children's smartwatch. The screen was dark, but Dad stared at it, his face twisting in absolute agony. He remembered. He remembered the phone call from yesterday afternoon. He remembered my voice, weak and desperate, telling him that there was no air. Enough. How long are you going to keep pretending? The basement is huge. How could there be no air? His own words must have echoed in his mind like thunder. He let out a choked gasp, dropping the phone onto the floor. The operator's voice was still squawking from the speaker. Hello? Sir? Are you there? We are dispatching an ambulance to your location. Sir? But Dad couldn't answer. He slumped against the wall, staring at his hands, his eyes vacant and shattered. He had killed his own daughter. He had hung up on her when she begged for her life. The house was soon filled with people. Red and blue lights flashed through the living room windows, casting eerie patterns on the ceiling. Paramedics rushed in with heavy equipment, but they left only minutes later, their faces grim, carrying a long, black zippered bag. Mom tried to cling to the bag, screaming and scratching at the paramedics until Dad and a police officer had to hold her back. I'm sorry, ma'am, one of the officers said, his voice quiet and professional. There was nothing we could do. She had been gone for hours. The police stayed. They walked around the basement with flashlights, taking photos. They photographed the heavy soundproof door, the bloody marks on the interior panel, the lock on the outside, and the dusty, empty space where the ventilation unit was supposed to be. A detective with tired eyes and a gray trench coat sat with my parents in the living room. Asher had been taken to a neighbor's house, leaving only the three of them in the quiet apartment. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, the detective said, his voice flat but observant. According to your statement, you locked your daughter in the soundproof home theater as a disciplinary measure? Mom was curled on the sofa, her face pale, her eyes red and swollen. She was clutching one of my old princess dresses to her chest, her knuckles white. She didn't look like the fierce lioness who had thrown Snowball out the window yesterday. She looked small, broken, and terrified. I didn't know the air wouldn't get in, she whispered, her voice cracking. I just wanted her to reflect on her actions. She lit an aromatherapy candle. Asher has asthma. He almost died. I was just so angry. And you locked the door from the outside? The detective asked, writing in his notebook. Yes, Dad answered. His voice was hollow, completely devoid of life. He sat stiffly on the edge of a seat, staring at the floor. The door has a heavy commercial latch. It can't be opened from the inside once it's locked from the outside. Did you receive any communication from her while she was inside? The detective asked, his sharp eyes shifting between them. Dad stiffened. I saw his fists tighten on his knees. For a moment, he didn't speak. He knew about the phone call. If he admitted he had hung up on me, it wouldn't just be an accident anymore. It would be something far worse. No, Dad lied, his voice barely audible. We didn't hear anything. The room is soundproofed. We were at the hospital with our son. I stood behind the detective, looking at my father. You lied again, Dad, I thought. Even now, you're trying to protect yourself. The detective didn't say anything immediately. He just stared at Dad for a long, agonizing moment, then nodded slowly. We will need to take the daughter's smartwatch and your mobile phones for analysis as part of the routine investigation. I'm sure you understand. Dad's face drained of what little color it had left. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He slowly nodded, his shoulders slumping as if under an invisible, crushing weight. The days that followed were a blur of gray. There was no funeral. My parents were too terrified of the neighbors' stares and the reporters who had begun lingering outside the apartment building. The news of a 9-year-old girl suffocated in home theater had spread quickly in the local community. People called it a tragic accident, but the rumors were far more vicious. They loved the boy more, the neighbors whispered in the hallways. They locked the girl up like an animal. My parents didn't leave the apartment. They ordered groceries online, and when they had to open the door, they did so quickly, keeping their heads down. The silence in the house was heavier than it had ever been. Before, the silence was because I was trying to make myself invisible, trying not to disturb my brother. Now, the silence was because the very air was poisoned with guilt. Mom spent her days in my room. She sat on my bed, holding my hand-sewed princess dresses, weeping quietly for hours. She didn't clean, she didn't cook. The kitchen, once filled with the warmth of her baking, was cold and messy. Plates with half-eaten food piled up in the sink. Anna, she would whisper, stroking the pink fabric of a dress. My beautiful girl. Mommy's sorry. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you scream louder? I sat on the desk chair, watching her. I did scream, Mom, I said, though my voice was only a soft sigh of wind in the room. I screamed until my throat bled. But you built the room too well. Dad stayed in his office, but he wasn't working. Through the cracked door, I saw him sitting at his desk, staring at his phone. The police had returned their devices after copying the data. They hadn't filed formal charges yet. The district attorney was still reviewing the case to decide between involuntary manslaughter or child endangerment, but the digital evidence was clear. Dad opened the call log. There it was. A call from Anna at 4:12 p.m. on the day of the incident. It lasted for 42 seconds. He played the recording. Because it was a smart device, his phone had an automatic call recording feature enabled for family numbers. Dad, save me. I can't breathe. My tiny, breathless voice echoed in the quiet office. Anna Johnson, you have the nerve to call? The basement is huge. How could there be no air? Dad's own voice sounded incredibly harsh, loud, and arrogant. He listened to the recording over and over again. Every time my voice cut out and his own angry tirade began, he would flinch, his eyes filling with fresh tears. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, as if he too were suffocating. He would bury his face in his arms, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. I leaned over his shoulder, looking at the screen. Do you hear me now, Dad? I whispered. I wasn't lying. Asher was the only one who didn't understand. He was only 2 years old. He would wander around the house, holding his favorite toy truck, looking into my room. Sister, he would call out, his voice high and sweet. Sister, play? Whenever Asher called for me, Mom would flinch as if she had been struck. She would rush over, grab Asher, and pull him into a tight, almost suffocating hug, sobbing silently into his hair. Asher would look confused, his little hands patting her back. Mommy cry? Sister back soon. Sister? Sister went to a faraway place. Mom would sob, her voice breaking. She's not coming back. But I was still there. I couldn't leave. I was bound to this apartment, to the cold basement, to the heavy soundproof door, and to the family that had destroyed me. I watched them crumble, piece by piece, from the inside out. A week later, the official autopsy report arrived, accompanied by a formal summons from the police department. Dad sat at the dining table, the documents spread out before him. His hair was messy, his eyes hollow with dark circles, and he hadn't shaved in days. Mom sat opposite him, her face completely blank, looking like a ghost herself. Involuntary manslaughter, Dad said, his voice flat. The prosecutor is offering a plea deal. If we plead guilty, we might get 3 to 5 years. If we go to trial. 3 to 5 years? Mom repeated, her voice suddenly rising, sharp and hysterical. And what about Asher? Who will take care of Asher? He has asthma, Richard. He needs his mother. We should have thought of that before we locked our daughter in a sealed tomb. Dad suddenly roared, slamming his fist on the table. It was the first time he had raised his voice since that day. Mom shrank back, staring at him in shock. You think I wanted this? Dad screamed, tears streaming down his face. Every time I close my eyes, I hear her. I hear her begging me to save her. And I told her she was a liar. I hung up on her, Helen. I killed our daughter. You didn't lock the door, Mom screamed back, her face twisting in rage and guilt. I locked it, but you didn't check on her either. You agreed to let her starve for a couple of meals. Don't put all the blame on me. If you hadn't thrown that stupid fit over a candle, none of this would have happened. She was trying to kill Asher. She knew he had asthma. She was 9, Dad yelled, his voice cracking. She was 9 years old, Helen. She didn't know. She just wanted her brother to sleep. She loved him. They screamed at each other, throwing bitter, venomous accusations back and forth, trying desperately to shift the unbearable weight of guilt onto the other's shoulders. I stood in the corner of the dining room, watching them. Once, they had been so loving. They had held hands, whispered sweet things, and promised to build a warm, happy home for me. Now, they looked like 2 starving wolves trapped in a cage, tearing at each other's flesh to survive. Asher began to cry from his bedroom, terrified by the screaming. Mom stopped mid-sentence. She let out a ragged breath, turned around, and rushed to Asher's room. Dad sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. The home they had built was gone. There was only a hollow shell left, filled with ghosts and bitter regrets. That night, a terrible storm hit the city. The wind howled outside, shaking the glass balcony doors. Rain poured down in sheets, blurring the lights of the city into dirty smudges of yellow and red. Mom couldn't sleep. She wandered around the apartment, her eyes vacant. She walked into the living room and stared at the balcony door. I followed her. She unlocked the door and stepped out onto the balcony. The cold rain instantly soaked her nightgown, plastering her hair to her face, but she didn't seem to feel it. She walked to the edge and looked down into the dark courtyard below. The spot where Snowball had died was washed clean by the rain, but in her mind, I knew she could still see the white shape. I'm sorry, Mom whispered into the wind, her voice swallowed by the thunder. I'm so sorry, Anna. I'm sorry, Snowball. She climbed onto the metal stool she had used to reach the window that day. She put one foot on the railing. Mom, I cried out, reaching for her, but my spectral hands passed through her legs. Don't do it, I pleaded, even though she couldn't hear me. If you die, who will take care of Asher? She stood on the wet railing, the wind whipping her thin nightgown around her. She closed her eyes, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. She looked ready to jump, ready to end the agony that consumed her every waking second. But then, from inside the apartment, a weak, muffled coughing sound drifted out. Cough, cough. Mommy? It was Asher. The damp, cold air from the open balcony door was triggering his asthma. Mom froze. She turned her head slowly, looking back into the warm, lit living room. She saw Asher standing by his bedroom door, rubbing his eyes, clutching his toy truck, his breathing shallow and labored. Mommy cold, he whimpered. Mom looked down at the dark courtyard, then at her sick son. A long, agonizing sob escaped her lips. She slowly climbed down from the railing, her body shaking so hard she collapsed onto the wet concrete of the balcony. She couldn't die. She had to live with what she had done. She had to stay in this purgatory she had created, caring for the son she had prioritized, while carrying the weight of the daughter she had sacrificed. She crawled back inside, closed the balcony door, and pulled Asher into her arms, weeping hysterically as she administered his inhaler. Dad stood in the hallway, watching her. He didn't offer to help. He didn't comfort her. He just turned around and went back to his office, locking the door behind him. The division between them was now permanent, an invisible, soundproof wall thicker than any concrete. As the months passed, the legal system took its slow, grinding course. Ultimately, because of their clean record and the lack of intent, my parents pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of negligent homicide. The judge, taking into account their young, dependent son with severe health issues, handed down a suspended sentence of 5 years with heavy probation and mandatory psychological therapy. They didn't go to prison, but they were far from free. They sold the apartment. No one could bear to live near that basement anymore, and moved to a small, nondescript house in a quiet suburb where no one knew their names. They packed up all my things. My princess dresses, my toys, my school books. Everything was packed into cardboard boxes and placed in a storage unit, never to be opened again. Except for one thing. Dad kept the children's smartwatch. He kept it in his top desk drawer, and every night, when the house was quiet and Mom and Asher were asleep, he would take it out. He had bought a charger for it, keeping it powered on. He would sit in the dark, staring at the small, glowing screen, and play the recording of my final call. Dad, save me. I can't breathe. He would listen to it once, twice, 10 times. It was his self-inflicted penance. He knew he would never hear my voice say, Daddy, again. He knew he would never get to apologize. This 42-second audio clip was the only connection he had left to the daughter he had failed. I sat on the edge of his desk, watching him. The anger I had felt was gone. The desperation, the fear, the pain, it had all faded into a quiet, cold acceptance. I forgive you, Dad, I whispered, reaching out to touch his graying hair. But I can't help you anymore. He flinched slightly, as if feeling a sudden, cool draft in the room. He looked up, his red, watery eyes searching the empty dark corners of his office, but he saw nothing. He slowly closed the drawer, turned off the desk lamp, and buried his face in his hands. One afternoon, when Asher was 4 years old, he was playing in the small backyard of their new house. He was chasing a yellow butterfly, his laughter ringing through the quiet air. Mom was sitting on the porch, watching him intently, her eyes never leaving him for a single second. She was older now, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with permanent worry. Asher ran near the wooden fence, then suddenly stopped. He stared at a small gap under the fence, his eyes wide. Sister, he called out, his voice hesitant. Mom stiffened, her body instantly going rigid. Asher, what is it? Come away from there. Sister's there, Asher said, pointing to the gap. She's white and fluffy. Mom's heart must have skipped a beat. She stood up, her face pale, and walked slowly toward the fence. She looked down. Under the fence, a small, stray white kitten was shivering, looking up at them with bright, green eyes. It was dirty, thin, and looked terrified. Asher looked up at Mom, his eyes shining with hope. Mommy, can we keep her? She looks like Snowball from the old pictures. Mom stared at the kitten. For a long time, she didn't speak. I knew what she was thinking. The doctor had said Asher's asthma had improved, but animal dander could still trigger an attack. Keeping a cat was a risk. But she also looked at the kitten's white fur, and then at the empty space beside Asher, where I should have been standing. She knelt down in the dirt, ignoring the stains on her trousers. She slowly reached out her hand, letting the kitten sniff her fingers. Yes, Mom whispered, her tears finally spilling over her cheeks, falling into the dry grass. Yes, Asher, we can keep her. She pulled the kitten into her arms, holding it gently, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. I stood in the bright sunlight, watching them. The warmth of the sun didn't heat my cold, spectral body, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt a sense of peace. My parents would never forget what they did. The shadow of my death would hang over this family for the rest of their lives, a silent, invisible presence in every room. They would never be truly happy again, and their love would always be tempered with fear and regret. But they were trying. They were trying to be better, to protect what was left, and to cherish the life they had nearly destroyed. I looked at Mom, at Dad, who was watching from the kitchen window, and at Asher, who was laughing as the kitten licked his fingers. "Goodbye," I whispered. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree in the yard. My transparent body began to dissolve, turning into tiny, glittering specks of light that floated up into the warm, blue sky. I was finally free.